Välkommen allesammans, welcome back to the channel where we use the actual historical sources to speak about Norse paganism. And today we are starting off the holiday season finally by talking about Christmas, or Yule. And as usual, there are way too many idiots talking about this and the pagan origins of Yule with absolutely no sources to back it up. Yes, we do know that our Christmas traditions have pagan origin, but how much of it exactly? And how much of it can be traced to Norse tradition? And how much of it comes from elsewhere. So today we are looking at what the sources say, speaking about pagan times and how they celebrated Yule. I'm going to call it Yule. That's not exactly the right word, and I'll explain about that in just a minute, but for the sake of this video I'm just going to call it Yule so we keep it organized. First, let's speak about the date. What time was it celebrated? A lot of people think it was originally in pagan times, celebrated on the winter solstice, but that's actually not right. It was actually celebrated on the next full moon after the winter solstice. Like many other pagan holidays, they had their holidays based around the full moon. So it would have been celebrated the first full moon after the winter solstice, which would be in January-ish, depending on the year. So there are a few sources from different places that speak about this. I'm not even going to try and read these because I'm not going to pronounce the damn things right. But the first one is The Reckoning of Time by Bede, and that was in Anglo-Saxon England in the year 725. The next one was a biography of Charlemagne, written in the mid-800s, and then another one in Iceland, the Althing calendar, recorded in the year 930. So here we have records about pagans in the Norse world, the Anglo-Saxon world, and the Germanic world, and they all have this very sacred day at the first moon right after the winter solstice. And they would have called these days different things in different areas, and of course probably even celebrated them slightly differently, but all of the Germanic peoples shared this special holiday in pagan times right at the same full moon. So we all have that in common, no matter which Germanic people you come from. So number two, why do we think of the pagan Yule being celebrated on the solstice? So we think of that, and why is it believed that way? Well, we have the answer here in Haakon the Good's saga. It tells how this king was trying to Christianize the Scandinavians at the time. Like most other holidays, he couldn't stop the people from practicing their pagan traditions, so he just moved the day to a Christian holy day instead. And it was said in ancient times that Jesus was actually born on the solstice. So King Haakon moved the celebrations to this day sometime before his death in 960. He moved it to the Yule celebration to be on the solstice. But it wasn't until about 600 years later, in 1582, when the Christian changed up the calendar from Julian to Gregorian, and then we have been celebrating since then Christmas on the 25th of December. But originally, since the start, like I said, Christians celebrated Christmas on the solstice all the way back to ancient Roman times, but pagans celebrated their Yule, as I mentioned, on the first full moon after the solstice. And other sources say that it's the first full moon after the new moon, after the solstice actually. So usually it's the same thing every year, but this year is a bit weird if you were wondering. It's actually not a new moon until quite a while after the solstice. So this year it could be on December 29th, or it could be all the way on January 28th if you go after the solstice and the new moon, but that's just in case you want to celebrate it yourself. So what about the name? Well, Yule was actually what it was called after King Haakon switched the dates to Christianize it. He writes in Haakon Saga, again, that before this time when it was celebrated on the full moon in pagan times, like I just mentioned, that it was called Midwinter Night, and specifically the first day of this celebration was called Haakonnatt. So, of course, this is just one name we have on record of what it was called in Norway before Yule, but the names would have absolutely varied all over the Germanic pagan world. They would have had lots of different names for that, so we just don't know all of them, but that's just one here. 4. How old is Yule? How old is this pagan celebration? Well, the word Yule, as I mentioned, is thought by scholars to have not come up until the mid-900s, until King Haakon's time. But we have some sources in England in the 800s where the month in December, January is called Giuli. And also in much, much older Gothic source from the 300s calls this month Fruna Jiuleis. I don't know how to pronounce that, but you'll see it here. So these are definitely some forms of the word Yule, and they were used hundreds of years before the Viking Age by other Germanic peoples. So that's the earliest written records we have of it, but scholars think that it's a very, very ancient holiday going back all the way to the Stone Age. They think that because of some archaeological evidence, reconstruction comparatives to other Indo-European cultures, it could be extremely, extremely old. Also note how in some sources Odin is referred to by the name as Julföder, or Christmas Father, or Yule Father. So that's just an interesting little point there about the name. It could be much older than we think. How long was Yule celebrated? Well, 3 days. 3 days. The pagan Yule was not just 1 day, but 3, and they were all considered very, very holy. We have a few sources that say this, as you can see here: Haakon Saga, Magnus the Blind Saga, and Helgakvida in the poetic edda. So on those last two, Magnus Saga and Helgakvida, they both speak about the peaceful time that had to be in these 3 days of Yule. They were about to have a battle in both of these stories, but they had to wait 3 days and 3 nights until this holiday was over, and this holiday was considered too sacred to fight in, and it seems like they weren't even supposed to work, really. They were just supposed to chill in these 3 days. So now I've spoken about the dates and some practical things. Let's get on to the festivities and traditions we have records of. First, we have the Blot. Yule was just one of the winter nights, or Vetrnaetr as they were called, which was a series of Blots at 3 different times in the winter. They had one in the start of the winter, one in the end of the winter, and one in the middle of winter, which is what Yule is. And as you can see here, these were celebrated, slightly differently in different places from what the sources say. I did a video on this, and that's in the link in the description below if you want to see. But generally, the Blot in midwinter would be an offering for a good harvest, as most of the sources say. In a source called Ynglinga Saga, it says how Odin established the custom that the Blot in midwinter should be done for a good harvest, like it confirms in other sources. Also, the Chronicon of Thietmar of Merseburg, which was, I think it was a Greek Orthodox guy writing about his contact with the pagan Danes around this time, and he said the Danes every 9 years had a massive Blot, and there was a sacrifice at Leire on this midwinter day. Every 9 years there was a big sacrifice. So it seems that every year at Yule time there would be some sort of Blot or offering and parties and festivities, kind of locally, but every 9 years all the people from surrounding areas would have a big meetup at the temple or Hof or capital or wherever, and have a big festival with offerings and animal and possibly even human sacrifices. But I'll get into that in another video. What are some other festivities? Well, gift giving absolutely happened at this time. The most detailed mention of gift giving around Yule time comes in St. Olav's Saga, but it's important to realize that the pagan Norse gave each other gifts all the time. They gave out gifts like it was chips and salsa to each other. They just read any saga, and sometimes they'll speak for a few chapters just about the gifts that two people gave each other. So there was absolutely a tradition of gift giving at Yule. But for the Norse, there was a tradition of gift giving at all the time in the Viking Age. It was just a gift giving culture. Pretty funny. What else happened? Well, sacrifices, or blots. In Heimskringla, it notes how people would come to the pagan temple and bring all the food that they needed for the 3 days that the festivities would go on for. After that, the traditional blot would happen with offering food, and they would slaughter animals, and the traditional blot way, they'd sprinkle the blood all over the people and smear the blood on the temple wall and outside. Also, specifically, it mentions in Heimskringla that the meat was boiled in a kettle at the center of the hall or temple, and the chieftain blessed the meat before it was eaten or while it was slaughtered. For sure, other festivities include big feasts with lots of eating and drinking. I won't go into all the sources that say this because there are a bunch of them saying how much people ate and drank, but I'll tell about one funny story from Halfdan the Black's saga. And that was the king and a few of his men who were at the Yule feast, and they stepped out of the hall for a short while, and when they came back in, all the food and booze was gone, so people stuffed their faces and drank their asses off, which is yet another source that confirms how much the pagan Norse like to drink and have a party. I see a lot of pagans out there, and they say that they're all sober and straight edge, and they call themselves Vikings. Man, if you don't drink, that's fine. Good for you, and I'm all good with that, but you can't call yourself a Viking because in every source that we have, it mentions them drinking their asses off. But it was at very specific times. They weren't alcoholics. It was kind of like a be sober, and then, you can save the drinking for special occasions and then have at it. Especially in the wintertime when there was not much work or anything else to do, they'd be drinking a lot. Also, there were lots of toasts at Yule time. Also in Heimskringla, it mentions that there was a first toast, and that was a toast to Odin and to victory. Then a second toast was to Freyr and a good harvest, which is the most important one, which what it was really about. And third was a toast to the king or chieftain that resided over the area. And also, some additional toasts were drank to the dead kinsmen in this source. Also, we have another source that speaks about a Jul Boar, the Christmas pig, or the Christmas ham. So in Hervarar Saga, they brought the feast. They brought a boar to the feast, and that was going to be sacrificed and eaten. But before that, people all swore oaths. They swore oaths, pledging loyalty to each other, some making promises to themselves, some people settling legal disputes, and they all went around pledging oaths to this boar before they killed and ate the boar. So this is probably where the tradition of eating a Christmas ham comes from. Also in Scandinavia, we have the most goddamn delicious thing in the world, and that's called julegrisen, and that's just a pig made out of marzipan, and that shows up everywhere around Christmas time. They look just like this, and I probably eat about 50 of those in the couple weeks around Christmas. They're damn delicious. So that's a very cool little thing that we still do today that probably has very ancient pagan origins. That's all we have for the sources pretty much about how Yule was celebrated in pagan times. Like I said before, these are just records from a few areas, and it's not sure whether these things were celebrated like this all over the Norse pagan world or Germanic pagan world. There were for sure some regional differences in different places, but they all would have had the same general guidelines. They would have celebrated kind of the same way with the same purpose. However, these are what the sources say that I've gone over here, but we're only at the halfway point here. There are probably a lot more traditions associated with the pagan Yule. And where do we find these things? Well, we can look at them in folk tales and records of holidays from remote areas of Scandinavia. Yes, these traditions start to get recorded in the 1300s, which was a few hundred years after the official Christianization of Scandinavia. But if you think that paganism ended in the year 1000 when Scandinavia officially became Christian, you have come to the wrong channel. About half of what I talk about is how pagan traditions and magic continued for hundreds of years after the official Christianization. Even though the official understanding and meanings of the myths had been lost. Some pagan traditions stayed around for hundreds of years, and some never died out. Like I said, we're still practicing some of them today. So I'm working on that video right now. That'll be released soon. When it does, I'll put that link in the description below. You can check to see if it's up there. But that's about it for this video. Vi ses nästa gång.